A beef brisket, what I like to do is take a beef brisket down to about 1/8 of an inch of trim all the way through the brisket. There's really two main parts to a brisket. If we flip it over here, you're looking at the flat of the brisket, and then on the top side here, where it's a little bit thicker, we're looking at what's called the point, which are your two main pieces. The advantage of trimming a brisket out is you will get a much more uniform consistency to the meat as far as the thickness. As you can tell, we got a very thick end versus a thin end. This thicker end here where the point is actually a lot of kernel fat that we're going to remove, which is going to thin it out and give you a much more even cooked product when we're finished. So that's part of the reason for it. The other reason is you have a lot of this excess fat that will not render in the cooking process. And it's very important to remove it before we cook it, because then when it comes time to slicing it after it's finished, you'll have a much nicer looking finished product. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing you want to look at is turn it over to your fat cap up, and you want to kind of feel your brisket. You're going to have very, very soft fat on the top, which is okay. You can leave that fat on the brisket for the smoking process, just keeping a couple little pocket windows where we're going to show the meat as I start trimming into the meat. Then you're going to have some thicker core fat over here on the sides. We want to make sure we remove that fat. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll start off with our thicker, heavier fat, which is much, much firmer here on the brisket. And we'll just start cutting into it and removing it a piece at a time. There's really not a great art to this. You want little windows or pockets of meat showing through, so you know where your meat's at, and then also so that fat will render into the meat, and the seasoning will also penetrate deeper into the meat when we rub the seasoning into the meat after we're done trimming it. So don't be afraid to show a little bit of the meat. All right, so when we're trimming this out, you want to make sure you do cut out any gray or brown that may be on the outside of your brisket, which you will run into occasionally. As you can see, you still got a nice deep red inside. So let's go ahead and just trim those edges off a little bit to clean that up. In the processing of your beef at the plant, they do steam the product on the outside, so it's very important you do remove that from the brisket, as it's going to be undesirable meat. So go ahead, it's usually nice to have a bowl or something on the side to put all your additional trim that you're cutting off and removing. Give yourself a little bit more room on your cutting board to play. Again, we're going to continue just to take a little off at a time of our surface fat, but again, a lot of this fat is good fat. You just don't want an overabundance of it in any one spot. Again, I'm constantly feeling the surface of the meat. Anything that's firm, which is going to be thicker in your fat content, is where you're safe cutting into it and removing that additional fat. Again, what I'm trying to create is a nice, maybe 1/8 of an inch layer of fat around the brisket with just a few pockets to add additional seasoning and flavor to the meat. Again, the reason for that is we want that fat to render into the meat to add additional flavor and moisture, but at the same time creating some opportunity to get the seasoning into the meat a little bit as well. Looks like we did a fairly good job. We'll just create a couple more windows to add additional room for seasoning and flavor. It's a little bit of a tedious process, but it's really something anyone can do. And it's one of these cuts of meats that you just got to kind of play with and experiment. And don't be afraid to try this at home. Did a pretty good job on this. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over and start looking at the back side. Now on this back side, we want to be a little careful because you do have some bigger chunks of fat here that you want to make sure you remove 100%. These are going to be quite thick and undesirable. Okay. You can see how thick this fat gets in certain parts of the meat. Now right here, you almost have to V the fat out because it goes very deep from the point to the brisket. And you do want to take that whole section out because it's nothing but undesirable fat. And again, we want to make sure we get our seasonings in there to get the flavors penetrating deep into the meat. And to do that, you really do have to remove the fat, like so. did a pretty good job of getting in there, getting most of our heavier fat out of there, which is what we want. See how thick this fat gets in certain parts here. It's very important to get in there and trim this out. Again, don't be afraid to take a little bit of meat with that because you really do want this piece of fat out. See how we beat that all out? There's very, very, very little meat on there, and that's not going to do you any good in the cooking process, but create extra thickness. Now we'll be able to fold that back down after we season it and have a much more uniform shape and size for smoking, which will create a better finished product. Okay. Keep a little fat in there. Please don't misunderstand me. We do want some fat in there because that will render into the meat and add additional moisture and flavor. All right, looks like we did a pretty good job there. We should be able to get in there real good with our seasonings to season that up. We're doing okay here. Again, maybe just one more pocket or so we can get a little bit more of that meat exposed so we get that flavor in there real good with the seasonings. Trim these edges off a little bit again, just to get any of that miscellaneous meat off the outside that's undesirable. There's pretty much all you gotta do.